You have a meeting tomorrow with someone who has been making you tired for 2 years. Not a monster. Not someone you could easily explain to HR or justify cutting off to a mutual friend. Just a person. A person whose name in your calendar does something specific to the quality of your Tuesday evening. A low-grade shift in atmospheric pressure. The kind of tired that starts before the meeting and ends well after it. You have probably told yourself it's the workload, or the season, or that you're just an introvert who needs more recovery time than most. These explanations are not wrong exactly. They are just pointed at the wrong thing. I spent the better part of a year managing my contact with someone like this, spacing out the interactions, keeping them short, being deliberate about timing in the way of someone who has accepted a recurring cost and is now optimizing around it. I thought I had solved it. Then someone entirely new walked into my life. Different city, different context, and within 3 conversations, I was doing the exact same math. That was when I understood what I'd actually been managing. It wasn't the person, it was the mechanism, and the mechanism had been politely waiting. This book is about that mechanism, not about the person you have in mind right now, though you do have someone in mind, and you have since the first sentence, and that specificity is the point. The person is not the problem. The person is where the problem becomes visible. The source of it is somewhere the self-help industry has been consistently reluctant to point, because pointing there is less comfortable than pointing at them. Here is the thing. Almost nobody says out loud about the people who drain you. They are not taking anything. You are spending something. In their presence, for reasons that made perfect sense once and may not anymore, you are running a version of yourself that costs more than it should. More careful, more managed, more edited, more of a performance than any ordinary Tuesday should reasonably require. The exhaustion is the cost of that performance. Not their fault, not entirely your fault, and not, this is the part that matters, fixed by distance alone. The mechanism travels. You have probably noticed this. Different people, same specific tired. Different context, same 2-day recovery. The cast changes. The pattern does not. Understanding the pattern is the only intervention that addresses the actual thing rather than just the latest instance of it. That understanding starts here, and it begins, as it has to, not with them. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The address is wrong. Most people, when they finally admit the drain is real, immediately do one thing. They look at the other person and start building a case. Picture Marcus, 41, senior project manager, genuinely good at his job. Every Tuesday, he has a one-on-one with his director, a man named Clive who is competent, well-meaning, and somehow the worst part of Marcus's week. After every meeting, Marcus sits at his desk for a few minutes doing nothing. Not thinking, just recalibrating. He's described it to his wife as being wrung out. She suggested Clive sounds difficult. Marcus has agreed because the alternative explanation hasn't occurred to him yet, and because he's difficult is a sentence that closes the question rather than opening it. The case Marcus has built on Clive is detailed. Clive interrupts. Clive subtly repositions other people's ideas as his own. Clive has a way of asking questions that sound curious, but feel like audits. All of this is probably true. None of it explains why Marcus needs 20 minutes of nothing after every meeting, or why a colleague who has twice as many interactions with Clive walks out of those same meetings looking completely unchanged. That last detail is the one worth sitting with. Because if the drain were a property of Clive, if Clive were simply draining, the way a radiator is simply hot, everyone near him would feel it equally. They don't. The drain is selective. It lands on some people and leaves others untouched, which means the drain is not actually about Clive. It is about whatever Clive activates in Marcus. This is the first, most resisted move the book is going to ask you to make. Not because it's complicated, because it's inconvenient. The moment you acknowledge that the drain is selective, that this person leaves you wrecked and your colleague unbothered, you've already accepted the implication. The variable isn't them. The variable is you. Here is how thoroughly people avoid this conclusion. They find other people who are also drained by the same person and treat this as confirmation. See? It's not just me. And maybe it isn't. Maybe Clive does drain multiple people. But multiple people being affected doesn't tell you anything about the mechanism. It just means whatever Clive activates, he activates in more than one person. The case against him gets larger. The actual question gets further away. They externalize the physical experience, the heaviness, the flatness, the 2-day recovery. All of it gets attributed to the other person as if they administered it directly. She exhausts me. As a sentence, this sounds like a report on her behavior. It is actually a report on your internal state. The exhaustion is yours. It is happening inside you. She did not install it. They try solutions that treat it as a logistics problem. Less contact, shorter interactions. The careful schedule management of someone who has accepted a recurring cost and is now optimizing around it rather than examining it. Sometimes this helps. Usually the relief is temporary, because the mechanism is still intact, and mechanisms don't care about your calendar. And then, this is the quietly devastating one. The same pattern appears with someone new. Different person, different context. Same specific quality of tired afterward. And now the case building starts again, and the new person gets added to a growing mental list. And somewhere underneath the frustration is a question that is trying very hard to surface. Why does this keep happening to me? That question is the right question. It is the only question this book is interested in. The wrong address isn't a moral failing. It is the completely natural result of where the experience seems to come from. The drain arrives in the presence of a specific person. They are therefore the obvious suspect. The logic is spatial. They were there, you felt it. They must be the cause. We use this logic constantly, and it usually works. Touch a hot stove, feel pain, the stove caused the pain. Reasonable, efficient, correct, but the drain is not the stove. The drain is more like an allergic reaction. The pollen doesn't cause the sneezing in any universal sense. Most people around you are breathing the same air, unbothered. The pollen encounters a specific immune system that has, for its own reasons, decided this particular substance is a threat. The reaction is real. The misery is real. And the address of the problem is not the pollen. This matters because solutions aimed at the pollen don't change the immune system. You can avoid pollen indefinitely and remain just as reactive to it. You can avoid Clive, schedule around him, reduce contact, eventually change jobs, and bring that same reactivity to the next person who triggers it. Sometimes avoiding the pollen is the right call. Sometimes the relationship has no value that justifies the cost, and distance is just the correct decision. This book is not arguing against distance. It is arguing that distance on its own leaves the mechanism untouched. And the mechanism will find another host. What does an accurate map look like? It has two locations instead of one. The other person is on it. Their patterns, their demands, the specific way they show up. That's real. And it doesn't disappear just because it isn't the whole story. But the map also has you on it. The version of yourself that activates in their presence. What that version costs. Why that version exists at all. The drain lives in the distance between who you naturally are and who you become when they're in the room. That distance is the mechanism. Everything else in this book is an explanation of why the distance exists, what created it, and what it would take to close it. Not by changing them. You have limited access to that project, and the return on investment is poor. By understanding what in you is generating the gap, and whether that gap is still serving any purpose at all. I once spent the better part of a year managing my contact with someone who genuinely left me depleted after every interaction. Spacing out the meetings, keeping them short, being strategic about timing. I thought I had solved it. Then I met someone else entirely, in a different city, in a different context, and within 3 conversations, I was doing the exact same math. That was the moment I understood that what I'd been managing was my exposure, not the mechanism. The mechanism had been politely waiting. This is also why the frame matters, not just for accuracy, for what's actually possible. If the drain is their property, your options are limited. You can manage proximity, you can minimize contact, you can exit the relationship entirely when that's available. These are real options. They help. But they require the problem to stay outside of you, which means the problem stays beyond your control. You are dependent on the other person changing, or on successfully avoiding them, or on luck. If the drain is a signal about what's happening inside you in their presence, the options multiply. The mechanism is yours. Yours to examine, yours to understand, yours, and this is the part that takes longer than it should to believe, to actually change. Not change in the sense of performing a different response, or thinking more positively, or deciding to care less. Change in the sense that what their presence activates in you becomes something you understand well enough to have a different relationship with. That's a longer project than blocking someone's number. It is also the only project that produces a result that stays. Marcus still has his Tuesdays with Clive. The case he's built on Clive has not gotten smaller. But the question he started carrying, what is it that I am doing in that room that costs this much, is a different question than the one he started with. It points somewhere he can actually go. The address on the complaint was wrong. It was always wrong. What you've been calling their drain is a receipt. And the purchase, when you finally read the line items, turns out to be yours. Chapter 2. What the body clocks first. The notification arrives at 9:14 on a Wednesday morning. Not a call, not a crisis. Just a name on a screen. A text from someone named Diane. And before you have read a single word of what Diane has written, before you have any information about what she wants or needs or is about to ask, something in your chest has already shifted. A faint tightening. A barely perceptible change in the quality of the next breath. You register it the way you'd register a change in air pressure. Not as a thought, not as a decision, but as a fact about the environment. Then you read the message. It's nothing. A question about weekend plans. Perfectly benign. And you respond warmly, and you mean it, and you put the phone down. And the tightening takes another few minutes to fully release. This is not anxiety. It is not irrational. It is not something to discuss with a professional, at least not primarily. It is your nervous system completing a pattern recognition task it has performed at this point, enough times to have formed something close to a reflex. It has filed Diane under a category, not consciously, not cruelly, just operationally. And the category triggers a specific preparation mode before your conscious mind has even entered the conversation. The body is not being dramatic. It is being efficient. What it is measuring, though, is not Diane. There is a version of this story that most people tell themselves, and it goes like this. Certain people produce a physical reaction because those people are stressful. The body detects the stressor. The body responds to the stressor. The stressor is the person. This is almost right. It is wrong in the way that a slightly incorrect address is wrong. Close enough to sound reasonable, wrong enough to send you to the wrong building every time. What the body is actually detecting, in that fraction of a second before you've read a word, is not Diane. It is the anticipation of a mode, a specific internal configuration that Diane's presence, or even Diane's name on a screen, reliably requires. Maybe it's the mode where you monitor your words more carefully than usual. Maybe it's the mode where you track her emotional state alongside your own, running two streams simultaneously, making small adjustments in real time. Maybe it's the mode where you become slightly less than fully honest, rounding your actual feelings to the nearest acceptable answer because the cost of the unrounded version is too high. The body has learned that Diane means that mode is coming, and the mode, not Diane, is what costs something. This is worth being precise about, because the difference between Diane is stressful and Diane activates a costly mode is not semantic. One of those framings points at Diane, the other points at the mode, and the mode is the only part of this equation you have any access to. The physical signature of drain is specific enough to be useful once you know what it's measuring. It is not the sharp activation of acute stress, that particular cocktail of adrenaline and focus that arrives when something is immediately threatening. Acute stress is unpleasant, but it is clean. It has a clear cause, a clear peak, a clear resolution. The body knows what to do with it. Drain is flatter and slower than that. It lives in the register of mild, sustained effort, the physical equivalent of holding a door open for a very long time. No single moment is particularly taxing. The accumulation is what costs you. And because no single moment is the culprit, it can be surprisingly difficult to locate when it started, or to justify, after the fact, why you feel the way you feel. This is why so many people dismiss it. The conversation wasn't difficult. Nothing bad happened. You weren't mistreated or overwhelmed or asked for anything unreasonable. You just feel, somehow, like you've been working for the past 2 hours without being able to point to what the work was. The work was the mode. The mode ran for 2 hours. The body kept the tab. There is a particular scene I have watched enough times to have stopped being surprised by it. Someone receives a phone call, or more commonly now, sees a name on their screen. And in the half-second before they answer or respond, their entire physical presentation changes. The shoulders do something. The face reorganizes. The posture shifts in a way that is not quite bracing, not quite preparing, but somewhere between the two. And then they answer, and their voice has a specific quality in it. Slightly more careful, slightly more managed, slightly more of a performance than the voice they were using 30 seconds earlier. What I find remarkable is not the change itself, it's the speed. The nervous system doesn't wait for information. It doesn't wait to hear what the call is about or what the person wants. It has already made its assessment and already begun preparing the costume. By the time the conscious mind is engaged, the mode is already running. The person afterward will often say, "That call took a lot out of me." And they will mean it, and they will be right. But what took something out of them wasn't the call. It was the 60-minute sustained activation of a mode that costs more than it looks like it costs, because the individual units of effort are small and the total only becomes visible at the end. When you're sitting somewhere quiet, wondering why you're so tired. The body as instrument is an underused concept in the context of relationships. We are relatively comfortable using physical sensation as data in other domains. The tight stomach before a difficult conversation tells you the conversation matters. The restlessness that arrives when you've been sedentary too long tells you the body needs to move. The specific exhaustion of genuine creative effort is different from the exhaustion of boredom. And most people can feel the difference without much analysis. But in the domain of other people, in the question of why certain presences cost more than others, physical sensation tends to get reframed as emotion, and emotion tends to get assigned an external cause, and the external cause tends to become the focus. I feel drained because she is draining. The sensation gets processed as information about her, rather than information about what is happening inside you in her presence. Redirect it. The next time you notice that pre-arrival tightening, the slight shift before a meeting, before a call, before a visit, don't ask what it's saying about them. Ask what it's saying about the mode you're about to enter. What version of you is getting ready to show up? What is that version going to be doing for the next hour that the regular version doesn't have to do? The answers will not always be comfortable. They are, however, almost always accurate. There is a second physical signal that people miss because they've normalized it. It's the release. The specific, quiet exhale, sometimes literal, sometimes just physiological, that happens when the interaction is over. When the call ends. When they leave. When you close the door and stand in the sudden, unremarkable peace of being by yourself again. Most people experience this as relief, which it is. But relief is a signal with a specific meaning. Relief is what the body produces when a sustained demand has stopped. You don't feel relief after conversations that didn't cost you anything. You don't exhale when someone you're completely comfortable with leaves the room. The relief is proportional to the preceding expenditure, and its presence is as precise a measurement of the drain as anything you could track consciously. Pay attention to the exhale. It is your body completing its accounting. What it's counting is not what they took. It is what you spent. Marcus, from the last chapter, has this. He doesn't have a name for it yet, but he has noticed, obliquely, that he tends to get a coffee after his Tuesday meetings with Clive. Not because he's particularly tired, or so he tells himself, but because the walk to the coffee machine is a few minutes of transition. What he is actually doing, without knowing it, is letting the mode decompress. The coffee is incidental. The 5 minutes of low-demand movement is the thing the body is requesting. The body always knows before the mind admits it. This is not mystical. It is mechanical. The nervous system processes the pattern before the narrative brain has assembled a story about it. And the story, once assembled, usually assigns the experience to the wrong cause, because the right cause is harder to sit with. And the story exists partly to make things manageable. But the tightening happened before the story. Before Diane's message was read. Before the mode was consciously entered. In that fraction of a second, the body was already telling you something true. It was telling you that you are about to become someone slightly more expensive than yourself. And it was right. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Start Chapter 3. The performance tax. Here is something nobody tells you about the versions of yourself you perform for other people. They don't feel like performances. They feel like you. That's what makes them expensive in a way that's almost impossible to account for. A conscious performance, the kind where you know you're performing, where you can feel the gap between the role and the person playing it, has a visible cost. You can feel it running. You can feel the effort of maintenance. You can, at minimum, explain afterward why you're tired. But the mode that activates in certain people's presence doesn't feel like that. It feels like a natural response to the environment. The way you might speak more quietly in a library without consciously deciding to. It feels like just how you are with this person. The adjustment is so fast, so practiced, so thoroughly incorporated into how you navigate their presence, that the cost is invisible. You're not performing. You're just being careful, being appropriate, being the version of yourself that works here. The tax is the same either way. Think about someone named Renata, late 30s, architect, sharp. She has a mother, Carol, who requires, and this is not a complaint, just a description, a specific version of Renata that Renata has been providing, with adjustments, since approximately age 9. The Carol version of Renata is warmer than standard Renata, more patient, less direct. She does not make certain jokes. She does not discuss certain subjects. She monitors the conversational temperature with the quiet attention of someone who has learned, through many years of calibration, exactly where the thermostat needs to be set to keep the room comfortable. She is not pretending to love her mother. She genuinely does. The performance is not dishonesty. It is management of the interaction, of Carol's responses, of the specific relational ecosystem they have developed over 3 decades. And Renata is very, very good at it, which is almost the whole problem. The performance tax is highest when the performance has been running longest. This is counterintuitive. You'd expect that a version of yourself you've been maintaining for 30 years would cost less than a new one. That repetition would produce efficiency. That practice would reduce the overhead. And in some mechanical sense, it does. The Carol version deploys automatically. Renata doesn't have to think about it, but automatic is not the same as free. The mode still runs. The monitoring still happens. The adjustments are still being made in real time, with the same precision they required the first time, just faster now. The efficiency is in the deployment, not the cost. The invoice arrives at the same amount. It just processes more quietly. This is why the people who drain you most are often not the difficult ones, not the openly demanding, the chronically needy, the transparently high maintenance. Those people at least have the decency to be obvious about what they're taking. The ones who generate the deepest, most persistent drain are often the ones you love most. The long relationships, the intimate ones, the ones where the version you perform has been refined over years into something so well-fitted that you've stopped noticing you're wearing it. You only notice when you take it off, The mechanics of the performance are worth understanding precisely because they're running faster than conscious thought. When you enter the presence of someone who requires a specific version of you, your nervous system runs a rapid situational assessment, not unlike the physical response described in the last chapter, but more cognitive in its output. It asks, in effect, who do I need to be here for this to go well? And the answer arrives before you've consciously formed the question. The assessment is based on history. Every interaction with this person has contributed data. The times you were more direct and felt the temperature drop. The times you softened something and felt the relief that followed. The times you tried a different version of yourself and observed the consequences. All of this is archived, and the archive is consulted automatically every time. The result is a version of you that has been iteratively optimized for this specific relational environment. It is, in a narrow technical sense, the most efficient response to this person that your history with them has produced. The problem is that efficiency in this context means effective at managing the dynamic, not effective at being genuinely present or honest, or at anything that would reduce the long-term cost. The optimization has been running in the wrong direction. There is a question worth asking, and it is slightly uncomfortable. Who built the original version? Because the Carol version of Renata wasn't assembled recently. It was constructed over decades, beginning when Renata was a child with far fewer options than she has now. The version was built under a specific set of constraints that were real, that made sense, that the child Renata had very good reasons to respond to in exactly the way she did. The child needed Carol's approval, needed Carol's stability, needed the room temperature to stay manageable because the consequences of it dropping were significant for a 9-year-old in a way they are not significant for a 38-year-old architect with her own income and her own front door. The version was built for those constraints. The constraints have changed. The version hasn't gotten the memo. This is the quiet absurdity at the center of the performance tax. You are often paying for a service that is no longer needed, at a price that was set when the circumstances were genuinely different, in a currency that has become significantly more valuable to you since the original rate was established. The version of you that shows up for Carol is not lying. It is not weak. It is not a failure of self-respect. It is a sensible historical artifact, a piece of adaptive engineering that solved a real problem at a real time with real elegance. It is just still running. I still notice it. A certain carefulness that enters. The voice shifts almost imperceptibly. The editing begins. A specific attentiveness to the other person's reactions that isn't present in other conversations. I am aware of it in real time now, which is not the same as being free of it. Awareness and freedom are related, but they are not synonymous. And anyone who tells you that naming a pattern dissolves, it has not spent much time with patterns. What awareness gives you is a slightly better view of what's happening. It does not hand you the off switch, but the view is something. It is the beginning of being able to ask, is this version still serving anything? Or is it an old answer to a question that has already been resolved? The performance tax shows up in the arithmetic of recovery if you're willing to do the calculation honestly. An hour with someone who requires nothing particular from you, no adjustment, no monitoring, no management of the relational temperature, costs roughly what an hour of moderately pleasant activity costs. You return from it at approximately the same level you left. Maybe slightly better if the company was good. An hour with someone who requires a specific version of you costs significantly more than an hour. The additional cost is the overhead, the mode, the monitoring, the maintenance of the version. And this overhead doesn't scale linearly with time. 2 hours in performance mode doesn't cost twice what 1 hour costs. It costs more than that, because the mode accumulates fatigue in a way that ordinary presence does not. This is why the calculation of how long do I have to see them misses the point. You are not managing time. You are managing mode hours. A 2-hour lunch in full performance mode can cost more than a full day of genuinely engaged, present interaction with people who require nothing artificial from you. And the recovery is not from the time. It is from the mode. Renata sees her mother every other Sunday. She has, over the years, developed a post-Carol routine that she would describe, if asked, as just how her Sundays tend to go. A particular walk, a particular amount of quiet, a particular reluctance to make plans for Sunday evenings. She does not think of this as recovery. She thinks of it as preference. It is both. The preference is real. The walk is genuinely enjoyable. But the timing of it, always after, never before, structurally dependent on the Sunday visit, the way a counterweight is structurally dependent on the thing it's balancing, is the tell. The body has built the decompression into the schedule. The routine exists because the mode requires an exit. Renata does not know yet that what she's managing isn't Carol. It's the version. The version that was built 30 years ago, for reasons that were then entirely reasonable, by a child who was doing exactly what she needed to do to make her particular situation workable. That child was not wrong. The version she built was not a mistake. It is just not the only version available. And it was never, not even at the beginning, not even when it was genuinely necessary, free. Chapter 4. The opinion you didn't mean to issue. At some point, you won't be able to identify exactly when. You handed certain people a vote on who you are. You didn't hold a ceremony. There was no conscious decision. You didn't sit down and think, this person's assessment of me will now carry significant weight in how I experience myself. It happened the way most important things happen, which is gradually and then all at once, and by the time you noticed it was happening, it had already been happening for a while. The vote is not the same as love, not the same as respect, not the same as admiration, though those things can be present too. The vote is something more operational than any of that. It is a background process, a quiet, continuous loop that runs something like, did that land right? Did they approve of that? What did that look like from where they're standing? It runs during conversations and after them. It runs when you're composing a message. It runs if the person has sufficient weight in the system when they are not present at all. And here is the specific way it generates drain. It turns every interaction with that person into an audit. Consider a man named Patrick. 44, runs a small consultancy, competent and largely confident in most areas of his life. He has a business partner, older than him, named Sylvester, who co-founded the company with him 11 years ago, and who Patrick would describe, if pressed, as a mentor. Sylvester is not cruel. He is not dismissive. He does not belittle Patrick or undermine him in front of others. He just has a specific quality of attention, a mild, intelligent skepticism that he brings to most things, that makes Patrick feel, in his presence, like a person awaiting a verdict. Patrick prepares differently for conversations with Sylvester than he does for conversations with anyone else. He thinks through his positions in more detail. He anticipates objections. He has, without fully noticing it, developed a habit of slightly over-explaining in Sylvester's presence, adding the extra layer of justification, closing the potential gaps preemptively, doing the defensive work before any defense has been requested. After their conversations, he replays them. Not anxiously, exactly, just checks the tape, makes sure nothing landed badly. Patrick would tell you, if asked, that he no longer really needs Sylvester's approval. He has built the company. He has the track record. He is not a junior partner seeking validation. He has decided, at the level of conscious belief, that Sylvester's opinion is one data point among many. His behavior tells a completely different story. The gap between what you consciously believe about someone's opinion and how your nervous system actually processes it is one of the more reliable sources of confusion in the drain experience. You can decide, intellectually, that someone's assessment of you no longer matters. You can mean it when you say it. You can build a coherent argument for why their opinion carries no particular weight. The relationship is professional, not personal. They don't know you fully. Their judgment in other areas has proven unreliable. You have, in measurable ways, outgrown their authority. The argument can be entirely correct, and then you walk into a room with them and the audit starts. The nervous system does not update its files based on conscious decisions. It updates based on accumulated experience, on repeated patterns, on the slow revision of what has been proven safe and unsafe over time. You cannot think your way out of an assigned weight. You can only live your way out through enough interactions in which you behaved as though the weight were different and experienced that the consequences were manageable. Until then, the vote counts. Whether you issued it or not, whether you want it to or not. There is a particular category of people who attract involuntary votes with unusual efficiency. They are not necessarily powerful in any formal sense. They are not always older or more successful, or in positions of obvious authority. What they share is a specific quality of presence, a certain imperviousness to the usual social management. They do not visibly perform approval. They do not provide the regular small signals of acceptance that most social interactions exchange as a kind of relational currency. They are not cold exactly, but they are economical. They give little away, and something in us, something that learned early on that withheld approval was the most significant kind, and that a person who gave nothing away had something worth earning, responds to this quality with a specific kind of vigilance. Sylvester is like this. He is not withholding approval strategically. That's simply how he is, measured, interior, slow to express. Patrick's nervous system does not know this, or rather, it knows it and doesn't care. What it has registered is the pattern. Approval from Sylvester is rare, and rare things acquire value through their scarcity, and now Patrick is running a system optimized for earning something that Sylvester dispenses approximately never. The audit runs, the drain accumulates. And Sylvester, being a reasonable man who thinks well of Patrick and has no idea any of this is happening, goes home on Tuesday nights completely unaware that he has been the source of anyone's exhaustion. The mechanism underneath this is one of the older ones in the psychological literature, though it's rarely described in a way that's useful at the level of daily experience. When you were being formed as a social creature, which began considerably earlier than you can remember, you learned which people's responses to you were significant. Parent figures, obviously. Early authority figures. The social group whose acceptance determined your standing. You learned to read these people with precision. You became, in their presence, highly attuned, monitoring, adjusting, interpreting every signal for information about how you were landing. This attunement was not a flaw. It was excellent calibration for the environment you were actually in. The cost of misreading the significant people was real and significant. The monitoring was a sensible response to genuine stakes. The problem is that the pattern generalizes. The nervous system, having learned that certain kinds of people signal significant, continues to apply that designation to people who match the profile. The reserved authority figure, the person who gives little away, the older professional whose skepticism reminds you, at some frequency below conscious thought, of someone else, someone whose approval once mattered in a context where it genuinely had consequences. Sylvester may, in some specific way, remind Patrick of someone like that. Patrick would probably deny it. That is not evidence against it. I once spent an hour carefully composing a message to someone whose opinion I had, genuinely and deliberately, decided no longer mattered. It was a professional exchange. Routine by any measure. The kind of message that should have taken 8 minutes. The hour was the data. The hour told me what the decision had not managed to change. And the gap between the hour the message took and the 8 minutes it should have taken. That gap, measured in units of careful word selection and preemptive justification, and the quiet, persistent background question of how will this land? That gap was the vote still running on a system I had told myself was already updated. It wasn't. The drain from an active vote is different in texture from the performance tax of the previous chapter, though they often run together. The performance tax is about being, about the version of yourself you inhabit in someone's presence. The approval loop is about landing, about how what you do and say and are is being received. One is about the output. The other is about the review of the output. Both cost something. Combined, they produce a specific quality of exhaustion that comes from the simultaneous effort of performing and monitoring the reception of the performance. This is what Patrick is doing with Sylvester. He is running both systems at once. The version he presents to Sylvester is slightly more thorough than his standard version. More buttoned, more justified, more prepared. And while that version is running, he is also monitoring Sylvester's responses with the attention of someone reading a document for information about whether they have passed or failed. You cannot hold your own presence and simultaneously audit its reception without cost. The attention required for both tasks is drawn from the same source. The divided attention is not just inefficient, it makes genuine presence impossible. You cannot fully be in a conversation you are also grading. The exit from the approval loop is not achieved through indifference. This is the common mistake. The attempt to stop caring what someone thinks by deciding their opinion has no value. This occasionally works for small votes, recent ones, relationships that have not been running long. For the deeper ones, the ones that were assigned years ago, the ones that match old patterns, the ones whose roots extend further back than the current relationship. Indifference is not available as a starting point. It is, at best, a long-term destination. The actual exit is something quieter and more mechanical. It is the gradual accumulation of experiences in which you behaved more honestly in that person's presence and observed that the consequences were survivable. Not comfortable necessarily, not without cost, but survivable. And the nervous system, which, remember, updates through experience rather than decision, starts to revise its threat assessment. Not quickly. These files are old and well defended, but the revision is possible. It begins when you stop treating the audit as mandatory, when you let one answer be shorter than it needed to be, when you let one thing land without checking the tape afterward. Patrick has not started this yet. He is still preparing. But at some point, probably on a Tuesday, probably after a conversation that cost him 40 minutes of mental replay, he is going to notice that he is performing a review that nobody requested. And that noticing, quiet as it is, will be the beginning of something. Chapter 5. The one they remind you of. There is a particular quality of drain that arrives fully formed, not built gradually over many interactions. Not the slow accumulation of a performance tax or an approval loop that has had time to compound. This one is immediate, almost instantaneous. You meet someone, or find yourself in a room with someone you've known only briefly, and the drain is already there. Not a mild version of it, the complete version, as if the usual warming-up period had been skipped entirely, and you arrived at the 2-day recovery feeling without logging the hours that should have preceded it. This is the drain that makes the least sense from the outside. You barely know this person. The relationship is new or shallow, or both. There is no long history of difficult interactions to point to, no accumulated evidence, no developed case. And yet, you leave their company feeling like you've just had the specific conversation you most didn't want to have, even if the actual conversation was entirely unremarkable. If you have ever tried to explain this one to someone else, you will have noticed how quickly it makes you sound unreasonable. There is no case to present. There is only the feeling, and the feeling, without evidence to support it, tends to get turned back on you. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe you caught them on a bad day. Maybe give it more time. The explanation that would actually be accurate is also the one that sounds the most like an excuse. It's not really about them. The nervous system is, among other things, a pattern-matching machine. It is extraordinarily fast at this, faster than conscious thought, by a margin that makes the comparison almost meaningless. Before you have processed someone's face, their voice, their particular way of entering a room or beginning a sentence, your nervous system has already begun comparing them against its archive. Not an archive of similar people exactly. An archive of similar configurations, patterns of interaction, relational dynamics, the specific grammar of how certain kinds of people behave in certain kinds of ways. When the comparison finds a match, or close enough to a match, it does not file the new person as a new person. It files them as an instance of the pattern. And the response it generates is the response the pattern has earned, not the response the specific individual has earned. This is efficient in the same way stereotypes are efficient. It processes complex social information very quickly using existing categories. It is wrong in the same way stereotypes are wrong. It responds to the category rather than the individual, with all the distortion that implies. The person in front of you has done nothing. They have simply, through some combination of manner and tone and energy and the particular way they occupy conversational space, activated a file that belongs to someone else. And you are now, in some functional and largely invisible sense, responding to that someone else. Think about a woman named Cecily, 36, works in publishing, thoughtful and self-aware in most areas of her life. She has a new manager, just transferred in from another department, named Howard. Howard is fine. By any objective measure, Howard is a perfectly reasonable person to work for. He is organized, fair, not particularly demanding. Her colleagues seem untroubled by him. Cecily cannot be in a meeting with Howard without leaving it feeling as though she has just survived something. She has examined this. She is not someone who avoids self-examination. She has looked for what Howard does that produces this result, and has found very little, a certain precision in how he asks questions maybe, a slight economy of expression, the way he listens without offering much in response until he has formed a complete view. None of these things are unreasonable behaviors. None of them explain the specific quality of careful, exhausted vigilance she feels walking out of every interaction with him. What she has not yet examined is who Howard reminds her of. If she did, she would find a fairly specific answer. Her father is a quiet, precise man whose approval was, throughout Cecily's childhood, both extremely significant and extremely hard to read. He was not cold. He was not unkind. He listened without offering much until he had formed a complete view. His questions had a certain precision to them. Howard is not her father. Howard is not even particularly like her father in most respects. But in the narrow register that the nervous system is scanning, the specific grammar of how authority figures relate to her, Howard has passed the threshold for pattern recognition. Cecily is not responding to Howard. She is responding to the file Howard accidentally opened. The thing that makes this particular drain so resistant to examination is that it feels completely justified by the present moment. The response is real. The vigilance is real. The exhaustion is real. And there is a person present, Howard or whoever has activated the file in your life, whose presence correlates with all of it. The correlation feels like causation because you are experiencing it in real time, in Howard's presence. During interactions with Howard, every piece of evidence your conscious mind can access points at Howard. The actual cause is somewhere you are not currently looking. This is not the same as saying the person is blameless, or that the dynamic is purely your creation, or that nothing about them is genuinely difficult. Howard may have qualities that would require management from anyone. The archive match does not excuse the individual. It distorts your response to them, makes it older and larger and more charged than their specific behavior warrants. But the behavior itself exists independently of the distortion. What the archive match does is ensure that your response to them is never quite about them. It is about them plus everything similar that came before them, compressed into a single reaction that arrives fully loaded and applies retroactively all the history that the current relationship hasn't earned yet. You are exhausted by Howard after 3 months. You would have been exhausted by him after 3 days. That speed is the tell. Real drain, earned through real interaction, builds. This kind arrives already assembled. There is a related phenomenon that is slightly different, but runs on the same mechanism. Not a person who activates an old response, but a person who activates an old role. Not someone who reminds you of a specific individual from your past, but someone whose presence in your life slots into a relational template. The dynamic itself, the pattern of how the relationship moves, the particular choreography of need and response and obligation that feels, from the first meeting, somehow already familiar. You have been in this dance before. The specific partner is new. The steps are very old. I watched a woman navigate a 2-hour dinner with a colleague she had known for about 4 months. What was remarkable, and this was visible from a few seats away, if you were paying attention, was the quality of attention she was bringing to him. A kind of careful, practiced management of the conversational space that you don't develop in 4 months. She was monitoring and adjusting with the ease of someone who had been doing this, with this particular configuration of person, for a very long time. The colleague was newly in her life. The moves were not. She had learned them in a different relationship over years, and they had activated cleanly in the presence of someone who matched the template closely enough. She was managing someone who, in some functional sense, she had been managing her whole adult life, just in a different body, with a different name, in a different restaurant. The uncomfortable version of all this is that the patterns don't just produce exhaustion, they produce repetition. You do not keep finding draining people because you have bad luck, or because you are somehow a magnet for difficult personalities, or because the world contains an unfair number of people who match the profile of the one who originally created the template. You keep finding them because the pattern is recognizable to you in ways that are not conscious, and recognizable things attract attention, and attention becomes proximity, and proximity becomes relationship. And before long, you are sitting across from someone who is making you tired in a way you cannot quite explain and have a vague, uncomfortable sense of having been here before. You have been here before. That's exactly right. You just haven't always been with the same person. Cecily will eventually have a conversation with a therapist, or a friend who asks the right question, or will simply lie awake long enough one night that the comparison surfaces on its own. She will see the overlap. She will feel, probably, a specific combination of recognition and resistance. The slight internal recoil of noticing something true that you'd have preferred not to notice. And then she will have to decide what to do with it. Which is not a simple process. You cannot simply decide to unfile someone. The archive doesn't respond to conscious instructions, but you can do something perhaps more useful. You can begin to relate to Howard as Howard, rather than as Howard plus file. You can notice mid-interaction when the response feels larger than the current moment warrants. You can ask what specific thing he did, as opposed to what the pattern has historically done, and whether those are actually the same thing. Often they are not. The person who stepped into the role is not the person who wrote it. They arrived later. They didn't audition. They simply matched a pattern your nervous system had been maintaining, faithfully and invisibly, waiting for the next instance. They stepped into something that was already there, and the exhaustion you feel in their presence has been accumulating, in some form, since long before you met them. Chapter 6. The Mirror Problem. This is the chapter most people will want to read quickly. Not because it's long, because there is a specific discomfort in here that the mind moves away from instinctively. The way you shift your weight off a bruise without deciding to. The instinct is to skim, to nod, to absorb the concept at a safe altitude where it applies to people in general and not to you in particular. To file it under interesting and move on before it can become accurate. Try not to do that. There is a quality in other people, some specific quality, and you probably already know which one, that produces in you a drain response that is disproportionate to anything they have actually done. Not the slow accumulation of a performance tax. Not the archive match of the last chapter. Something more immediate than that, and more charged. A quality that you encounter in certain people and that produces, reliably, a reaction that is slightly too large for the situation. An irritation that rises faster than it should. A fatigue that sets in earlier than the interaction warrants. A specific, quiet intensity to your response that you have probably, at various points, justified with evidence about them. Their behavior, their patterns, the ways they impose themselves on a room. The evidence is usually real. The behavior is often genuinely difficult. You are not wrong that the quality exists in them, but the size of your reaction is not fully explained by what they're doing. And the size, looked at honestly, is a signal. It is pointing somewhere. It is pointing at something in you that you have not finished dealing with. The psychological mechanism here has a long history and several names, none of which are particularly useful in daily life. What is useful is the functional description. The qualities in other people that produce our strongest, most disproportionate responses are frequently qualities we have not made peace with in ourselves. Not always. Sometimes a person is simply difficult. and the strong reaction is proportionate, and there is no mirror involved. The test is not the reaction itself. The test is the ratio, the size of the response relative to the provocation. When the ratio is off, when the irritation or the exhaustion or the very specific kind of drain you feel around this quality is notably larger than the behavior seems to warrant, that disproportion is the signal. The signal is not, "This person is worse than you think." The signal is, "Something in you recognizes this." Think about what it costs to keep a quality suppressed, not a quality you've simply never had. That costs nothing, because there's nothing to maintain. But a quality you have, and know you have, and have spent considerable effort learning not to express. The impatience you've disciplined into patience. The self-interest you've trained into generosity. The neediness you've converted, through years of work, into self-sufficiency. The anger that you have, in most contexts, successfully routed into something more acceptable. These qualities don't disappear when you suppress them. They go quiet. They go underground. They become managed rather than absent. And the management requires something, a continuous, low-level expenditure of energy devoted to keeping the suppressed quality from surfacing. You've been paying that cost so long, you've stopped noticing it. It's in the budget. It's just the cost of being who you are. Now put you in a room with someone who is expressing that quality freely. They are not suppressing it. They are not managing it. They are simply being needy or angry or self-interested or whatever the quality is, without apparent effort or apology. And something in the room changes. The cost of your own suppression suddenly becomes visible by contrast. You can feel the gap between what they are freely doing and what you have been carefully not doing. And that gap, that specific, uncomfortable awareness, translates in experience as a reaction to them. The drain is partly the cost of the suppression, and their presence is what made it visible. This is where most versions of this idea go wrong. They present it as, you dislike in others what you dislike in yourself. Which sounds like a parlor trick. Which sounds like it's saying that if someone's behavior annoys you, you secretly do the same thing. Which most people immediately disprove with a counterexample. I find passive aggression exhausting, and I am not passive-aggressive, and then dismiss the whole framework. That's not quite the mechanism. You don't have to do the thing. You have to have the thing and be managing it. The person who finds passive aggression most draining is often not the most passive-aggressive person in the room. They may genuinely express conflict more directly. But somewhere in the history of how they learned to do that, there was a version of them that understood passive aggression from the inside, that felt the pull of it, that may have used it at some point, that was taught, one way or another, that it was not acceptable, and who has been, since then, maintaining a specific distance from it. The person who expresses it freely is not just doing something annoying. They are doing something that cost the observer something to stop doing, and the observation reactivates that cost. Not always consciously. Often as irritation or fatigue or the very specific texture of drain that comes from a quality you can't quite put language to, but which you cannot be in the presence of without effort. The qualities that tend to generate this response cluster in a recognizable way. Neediness, in people who have learned self-sufficiency at some personal cost. Entitlement, in people who were taught, early and firmly, that their needs were not automatically legitimate. Emotional expressiveness, in people who learned to manage their emotional expression carefully as a condition of their relationships being safe. Ambition, in people who were taught that wanting things openly was somehow unseemly. Anger in people who were taught it was dangerous. What they share is not that they're bad qualities. They're not. They are human qualities, neither good nor bad in themselves, that some people learned to suppress and others did not. The ones who suppressed them will find the ones who didn't disproportionately exhausting. Not because those people are doing something wrong, because their freedom is a reminder of a cost. I recognized this later than was comfortable. The person whose emotional intensity most exhausted me, whose need for processing, for talking things through, for circling back to feelings I had already filed and moved on from, was the person most similar in that specific register to a version of myself I had spent years learning to keep quiet. The version that also wanted to process, also wanted to circle back, also found feelings worth extended attention. I had learned somewhere along the way that this version was too much, that it asked for more space than was available, that the efficient response was to feel things faster and move on. I had done that. I had become quite good at it. And then I sat across from someone who hadn't, who simply occupied that emotional register without apparent apology. And I called it exhausting, and the exhaustion was real. And it was not, or not entirely, about them. Here is the part where a different book would offer you something to do with this. A reframe, a practice, a way of using the recognition to transform the relationship with the quality you've suppressed, so that other people's freedom with it no longer costs you anything. Something actionable that would let you close this chapter feeling that the discomfort had been useful and is now, at least in principle, addressed. This chapter is not going to do that, because the point of this chapter is not to resolve the discomfort. It is to let the discomfort be accurate. To let the thing that is true here be true without being immediately converted into something more manageable. You have encountered something in yourself that you have been working around for long enough that the work has become invisible. The recognition of it, the actual, specific, "this applies to me" recognition, is worth more than any practice that could be offered in the next 2 paragraphs. The person who drains you has not been delivering a verdict on you. They have been, without knowing it, holding up something that was already there. What you do with that is not a question for this chapter. This chapter only asks you to look. Chapter 7. The kindness that costs you. You are probably good at reading rooms. Not just good, skilled. Practiced in the way that only comes from starting early and having adequate motivation. You notice when the temperature in a conversation shifts. You register the slight tightening around someone's eyes before they've processed the feeling themselves. You can feel the moment a room needs something, needs lightening or steadying or a particular kind of careful attention. And you have, in most cases, already begun providing it before anyone has asked. This is a genuine skill. It is not nothing. In many contexts, it has served you and the people around you extremely well. You have smoothed things that would otherwise have been rough. You have absorbed impacts that would otherwise have landed harder. You have, on more occasions than you can count, made something easier for someone who needed it to be easier. None of this is in question. What is in question is what it costs when the skill runs without being asked. Here is something worth being precise about. There is a version of attentiveness to other people that is a form of genuine presence, and there is a version that is a form of chronic management. They can look almost identical from the outside. They feel completely different from the inside. And the difference between them is not in the behavior. It is in what is driving the behavior. Genuine attentiveness responds to what is actually happening. It notices and it responds, and when there is nothing to respond to, it rests. It is present in the way a good conversation partner is present, engaged, alive to the moment, but not working. Chronic management responds to what might happen, to what could go wrong if the temperature drops, to what this person might feel if that thing is said, to the projected discomfort of a situation that has not yet become uncomfortable and may never become uncomfortable. If you can just keep the variables sufficiently managed, it does not rest. It cannot rest. Because its entire operating premise is that something bad is available and that your job is to prevent it. The management is not responding to the room. It is responding to a threat model. And the threat model, in most cases, is significantly more pessimistic than the actual room warrants. Consider a man named Joel, 32, close with his family, the person everyone in his circle would describe as emotionally available, generous, the one you call. He has a long-term partner named Simone, who is, by any account, a reasonable and emotionally functional person. Simone does not make excessive demands. She does not require constant reassurance. She is not fragile. Joel manages her anyway, not in a controlling way, in the way of someone who has learned, at a level beneath conscious decision, that the safe move is always to ensure the other person is comfortable before attending to himself. He monitors her emotional state during conversations with the focused attention of an air traffic controller. He softens things that don't need softening. He edits his actual responses in real time, rounding them to the nearest version that will land without friction. He does this automatically, without checking whether the friction, if it occurred, would actually be a problem. Simone does not know the full extent of this. She knows Joel is considerate. She values it. What she cannot see, what Joel has not seen clearly until recently, is the quiet accumulation of unexpressed things. The responses that were rounded. The reactions that were managed before they were felt. The gradual, almost imperceptible narrowing of what Joel actually brings to the relationship versus what he has pre-approved for Simone's emotional comfort. The relationship is not in trouble. It is simply operating on less than it could be. And Joel ends most evenings with a specific quality of flat tiredness that he has attributed, variously, to work, to the news, to being an introvert who needs recovery time. What he has not attributed it to is the 8 hours of low-level emotional management he has been performing, partly on Simone's behalf, mostly without her knowledge, entirely without her request. The origin of chronic management is not mysterious, and it is not a character flaw. It was learned. In an environment where the management was necessary, where the emotional states of the people around you were genuinely variable in ways that had real consequences for you, where the cost of not reading the room correctly was high enough to make room reading a survival skill. The child who develops this attunement is not doing something wrong. The child is responding to a real environment with a sensible and effective adaptation. The problem, familiar from earlier in this book, is that the adaptation does not update when the environment changes. The management continues to run. It runs in relationships where the other person is stable and does not require it. It runs with people who are fully capable of handling an unrounded response. It runs with people who have never indicated, through any behavior, that their emotional comfort is your responsibility to maintain. It runs as a default, not because the current situation demands it, but because the system was never given instructions to check whether the current situation demands it before deploying. The skill became a reflex, and reflexes, by definition, do not consult the present moment before firing. There is a specific cost to this that is separate from ordinary tiredness and worth naming precisely. When you manage another person's emotional state preemptively, before they have expressed a need, before the situation has actually required it, you are spending something that is not quite energy and not quite emotion. You are spending presence. The attention required to monitor and manage the room is attention that is not available for being in the room. You are simultaneously participant and stage manager, and the stage manager role runs quietly enough that it does not feel like a second job. But the cognitive and emotional bandwidth it consumes is real. The result is a specific kind of exhaustion that is hard to justify because nothing difficult happened. The conversation was fine. The evening was pleasant. Nobody asked for anything unreasonable. And yet you are tired in the specific way of someone who has been working, and the work was invisible. And because it was invisible, you have nowhere to point when you try to explain the tiredness. You spent the evening managing a situation that was not, in fact, in need of management. You were solving a problem that was not occurring, and the cost of solving a non-existent problem is the same as the cost of solving a real one, because the system that does the solving does not first verify whether the problem exists. I said, "I'm fine" once, completely automatically, with the smoothness of a line I have delivered so many times it no longer requires thought. In a moment when I was genuinely not fine. What is notable, looking back, is not that I said it. It is that the person I said it to had not asked. They had not inquired about my state. There was no question on the table that required the answer, "I'm fine." The management deployed in the absence of any trigger, except the presence of another person and the old, unexamined assumption that my actual state was not appropriate for the room. That reflex, running unexamined across years and relationships, is what this chapter is about. Here is the turn that most versions of this conversation do not make, and the one this book has been building toward since chapter 1. The drain you have been experiencing in certain relationships, the flatness, the tiredness, the specific quality of depletion that arrives after interactions that were, by all visible measures, completely fine, is not being done to you. It is being generated by you, not because you are doing something wrong, not because your care is excessive, or your attentiveness is a pathology, or your generosity is a problem to be solved, but because a system that was built for a specific historical environment has been running, without modification, in environments that no longer require it. The management is real. The cost of the management is real. The thing that is not real is the threat the management was built to prevent. You have been solving a problem that stopped existing some time ago. The solution is still costing you. The problem is no longer there to justify the cost. This is not a verdict on you. It is a description of a mechanism. Mechanisms can be understood and adjusted, but the adjustment cannot begin until the source of the cost is correctly located. For the first 5 chapters of this book, the source appeared to be other people. In chapter 6, the source began to shift. Here, in chapter 7, it has arrived at its actual location. The drain that you have been calling theirs in this specific pattern, in this specific configuration, is yours. Not because they are blameless, not because the relationships are uncomplicated, not because nothing about them is genuinely difficult, but because the management, the room reading, the preemptive softening, the automatic rounding of your own responses to the nearest acceptable version is running on your end. Uninstructed, unverified, at a cost that does not appear on any invoice because you have been submitting the bill to the wrong address since before you knew there was a bill. Joel has begun to notice the flat tiredness. He hasn't located it yet, not fully, but he has started in small moments, to catch the edit before it happens, to notice the rounding, to feel the shape of the actual response before it becomes the managed one. He doesn't always choose differently. The reflex is fast, and the alternative feels, for now, like a risk he isn't sure how to calculate. But noticing is not nothing. The managed version of Joel has been keeping everything smooth and comfortable, and slightly less than real. The question he is beginning to ask, quietly, without ceremony, in the ordinary moments of an ordinary relationship, is whether the smoothness is worth what it's costing, and whether Simone, who never asked for it, actually needs it, or whether it was always underneath everything for him. Chapter 8. Why some people don't run low. There is a person in your life, possibly several, but there is always at least one who seems to move through difficult interactions without accumulating the residue you accumulate. You have probably observed this with a mixture of respect and mild resentment. They have the same conversations you have. They deal with the same difficult colleagues, the same demanding family configurations, the same relational friction that leaves you needing a Tuesday evening to recover. And they walk out of those interactions looking, if not energized, then at least intact, level. As though the interaction happened and then was over, rather than happening and then continuing to happen inside them for the next several hours. You have probably generated theories about why. They care less. They're more selfish. They have a thicker skin, whatever that means. They simply don't feel things as deeply, and their apparent resilience is actually a form of shallowness. An enviable shallowness, maybe, but shallowness nonetheless. These theories are almost always wrong, and they are wrong in a specific way. They locate the difference in what the undrained person feels, rather than in what they spend. Think about a woman named Priya, mid-40s, runs a team of 12, known in her organization as someone who is both genuinely warm and unusually difficult to rattle. She has an elderly parent who calls daily and requires significant emotional presence. She has a colleague, a man named Dennis, who is objectively one of the more draining people in the building, needy in the specific way of someone who has learned to dress neediness as collaboration, demanding in the way of someone who frames demands as questions. People manage their calendars around Dennis. Priya does not. Priya is not cold. She is not detached. She does not process the world from behind glass. If you watch her in a conversation, with her parent, with Dennis, with anyone, she is present in the fullest sense. She listens with her whole attention. She responds to what is actually being said, rather than to her preparation for what might be said. She does not appear to be performing anything. What she is not doing, and this is the whole answer, stated plainly before the unpacking, is solving problems that haven't been presented to her. The undrained person has not achieved a superior form of detachment. They have somehow arrived at the absence of a specific layer that most people are running constantly. The management layer, the preemptive monitoring, the room temperature tracking, the ongoing background process that asks, in the presence of another person, what might go wrong here, and what can I do right now to prevent it? This layer, familiar from the last chapter, where it was described as chronic management, is what generates most of the overhead in human interaction. Not the interaction itself, not the other person, not the content of the conversation or the difficulty of the relationship. The layer, the cost of running it in every interaction as a default setting. Priya doesn't run it. Not because she disciplined it away, not because she made a decision to stop caring about outcomes, But because somewhere in the history of how she developed relationally, the layer either didn't fully form or was interrupted before it became automatic. She responds to what is actually in the room, the actual Dennis asking the actual thing he's asking right now, not the projected Dennis with all his potential future demands, pre-managed into a shape that will cost her less. The actual room is almost always more manageable than the projected room. This is the insight that everything in this chapter turns on. There is a scene worth describing in some detail. Dennis appears at Priya's office door. This happens. It is a known occurrence on their floor, with the specific body language of someone who has arrived with a problem they are about to make collaborative. He has a question. The question will become a conversation. The conversation will involve more than is strictly necessary, because Dennis processes out loud and at length and treats the presence of another person as an invitation to continue. A different colleague, earlier that day, had seen Dennis coming and found a reason to be somewhere else. Another had answered his question in a single clipped sentence and then become very interested in her screen. Both responses involved Dennis being managed, his potential demands anticipated and either avoided or curtailed. Both cost something in the form of the vigilance required to see him coming and the mild stress of executing the deflection cleanly. Priya looked up when Dennis appeared. She gave him her attention. She let the question be the question. She answered it thoroughly because she is thorough. And when Dennis predictably extended the conversation slightly past its natural conclusion, she said, without apparent difficulty, that she needed to get back to what she was doing. Not coldly, not as a performance of boundaries, simply as a true statement about what was next for her, offered without apology. Dennis left. Priya returned to her work. The interaction had lasted 11 minutes and cost approximately 11 minutes. The colleague who had avoided Dennis entirely had spent 40 minutes in anticipation, in maneuvering, in the mild, ongoing stress of hoping he wouldn't circle back on a conversation that never happened. This is the specific thing the undrained person does differently. They spend the cost of the actual interaction, not the projected interaction, not the worst-case interaction, not the interaction plus the overhead of managing every possible version of the interaction before it occurs. The actual one, which is almost always cheaper than the managed version. This is not a natural ability for most people. It is not about personality type or introversion or emotional constitution. It is a function of a specific underlying belief about what the other person's emotional state costs you. The chronically managed person, Joel from the last chapter, or Marcus from chapter 1, or you, possibly, operates from an implicit assumption that the other person's discomfort or need or demand is automatically their problem to solve. The assumption is not conscious. It is structural. It runs underneath every interaction like a standing instruction. If they need something, that need is addressed to you. Priya does not have this instruction, or she has it in a much weaker form. When Dennis needs something, the need is Dennis's. She can choose to help, and she often does, but the need does not automatically transfer to her account. It remains his until she decides, actively, to take it on. The distinction sounds small. The difference in cost is enormous. What makes this difficult to acquire is that it can look, from inside the managed person's experience, like indifference. When Joel imagines not preemptively managing Simone's comfort, what he imagines is a version of himself who doesn't care whether she's okay. The two things, active management and caring, have become so thoroughly associated in his operating model that their separation feels like loss. To stop managing is, in Joel's current internal logic, to stop loving. And so the management continues, and the cost continues, and the exhaustion continues. And the thing that is actually happening, that the management is a historical artifact, not a contemporary necessity, remains out of reach. The undrained person has made, consciously or not, a different association. They have learned, or perhaps never had to unlearn, that caring and managing are separable. That genuine presence with another person does not require solving their problems before they've presented them. That the kindest thing you can offer someone is often actual engagement with who they are, not preemptive smoothing of everything they might feel. This is not the same as not caring. It is the same as caring without the overhead. Caring without overhead is what Priya looks like from the outside. Level, warm, somehow available in a way that the anxiously attentive person, paradoxically, is not. Because the anxiously attentive person is not fully in the room. They are in the room and simultaneously backstage, running the production. You cannot be both places at once. The backstage work is real, and it is expensive, and the cost is paid in presence. The very thing the management was meant to protect. There is something else worth naming, which is that the undrained person is not unaffected by difficult interactions. They simply have a different relationship with the aftermath. The residue, the replay, the analysis, the extended processing of what happened and what it meant and whether it landed right. This is where a significant portion of post-interaction cost accumulates. The interaction ends. The managed person continues having it. They check the tape. They revise the responses they gave. They pre-construct the responses they'll give next time. They continue monitoring in the interaction's absence, the variables that are no longer present. Priya does not do this, or does it minimally. The interaction happened. It is over. Dennis asked his question. She answered it. He left. The file closes. This is not suppression. She did not push the experience down or refuse to process it. She processed it in real time, actually present, actually engaged, actually responding to what was there. The real-time processing was sufficient. There is no backlog because there was no deferral. The person who defers processing, who manages the surface of the interaction while their actual responses queue up for later, will spend the evening on that queue. Not because they are weak or ruminating pathologically, because they did the thing that creates the queue. The deferral is upstream. The evening processing is the consequence. The observation is not that Priya is better at this. It is that she is doing something structurally different that produces a structurally different outcome. The structure is available. It is not a personality trait locked in at birth. It is a set of operating assumptions about whose needs are whose, about what caring requires, about what the actual cost of the actual interaction is versus the projected cost of the managed version, that were formed at some point and can, with sufficient understanding of how they formed, be reformed, not quickly, not through deciding to be more like Priya, not through a set of practices that simulate the absence of the management layer while the management layer itself remains intact underneath. Through understanding what the layer is doing, why it formed, and whether the conditions that made it necessary still exist. They probably don't. They probably stopped existing some time ago. The layer is still running anyway, as layers do, because nobody told it the emergency was over. Chapter 9. The boundary that isn't a fence. Somewhere in the last decade, the word boundary became a self-help product. It acquired a specific aesthetic. Confident, clean, slightly performative, it came with scripts. I need you to know that when you do X, I feel Y, and I need Z. It came with the implication that the primary obstacle between you and a less exhausting life was the failure to have communicated your limits clearly enough, and that the solution was a better worded sentence delivered with sufficient conviction. This is not useless. There are relationships where clearer communication about what you will and won't accept produces a genuine shift. There are people who were simply operating without accurate information about your limits, and who, once informed, adjust. These relationships exist, but the conversations this book is actually about, the drain that recurs, that survives the polite limit setting, that shows up with different people in different contexts and produces the same specific quality of tired. That drain is not addressable by a script, because the script targets behavior, and behavior is downstream of mechanism. You can redirect a river at the surface and leave the source entirely untouched, and the river finds another route, and you find yourself 6 months later having the same conversation with a different person and wondering why the script isn't working. The boundary that actually works is not a sentence. It is an internal shift that precedes any sentence, makes most sentences unnecessary, and changes what the other person's presence can cost you regardless of what they do. Here is the shift, stated plainly before the unpacking. It is the moment, and it is a moment, not a process, not a gradual achievement. When you stop treating another person's emotional state as a problem that has been assigned to you, not because you don't care about them, not because their emotional state is irrelevant to you, not because you have successfully cultivated indifference or achieved some elevated state of non-attachment, but because you have recognized, clearly enough, that the recognition has traction, that their emotional state is theirs. It arrived with them. It belongs to them. Your presence may influence it, as presences do, but it is not yours to manage, fix, absorb, or preemptively prevent. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It is, for people who have been running the chronic management pattern, genuinely one of the harder internal moves available. Because the management has been running so long and has become so structurally embedded in how they relate, that its absence feels less like relief and more like negligence. Picture a specific moment. Joel, from Chapter 7, the one who manages Simone's emotional states with the diligence of someone who was trained early that this was his job, is sitting across from her at dinner. She is telling him about a difficult day. Something at work went wrong. She is frustrated, and the frustration is in her voice, and the old system is already running, monitoring the temperature, preparing the responses, calculating what she needs from this conversation and how to provide it efficiently. And then something interrupts the calculation. Not a decision, exactly. More like a recognition. The recognition is this. Simone is a capable adult who has been managing her own emotional states for 32 years. She managed them before she met Joel. She will manage them after conversations he is not present for. Her frustration about work is real and it is hers. And it does not require Joel's intervention any more than his frustration about work requires hers. She has not asked him to fix it. She has not asked him to manage it. She has, in fact, simply started talking, which is what people do when they want to be heard. What she wants is presence. What Joel has been offering is management. These are not the same thing, and the management, however well-intentioned, is not only costly to Joel, it is subtly insufficient for Simone. Because a person who is being managed is not quite being met. Joel puts down the calculation, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. He listens. Not to find the problem so he can solve it. Not to monitor the temperature so he can regulate it. He listens the way you listen to something that does not require a response, with his actual attention, undivided by the backstage work. Simone notices. She cannot name what is different. It just feels, somehow, more like being with someone. Joel notices something too. The dinner costs him less than dinner usually costs. The internal shift has a specific structure, and understanding the structure makes it more accessible than treating it as a vague aspiration toward being more zen. It has 3 components, and they operate in sequence. The first is recognition. Whose problem is this actually? Not rhetorically, genuinely. Does this person's emotional state require something from you right now? And if so, have they asked for it? And if they have asked for it, is providing it something you are choosing to do or something you are doing because the alternative feels dangerous? The second is the pause between recognition and response. This is the functional boundary. Not a wall, not a script, but the moment of space in which the management reflex can be noticed before it fires. The reflex will still want to fire. The pause is not about stopping it permanently. It is about inserting enough space between stimulus and response that a choice becomes available, where previously there was only a reflex. The third is choosing presence over management. Responding to what is actually in the room rather than to the projected version of what might happen if you don't manage it. This is the shift that Priya from Chapter 8 operates from naturally. For the chronic manager, it has to be chosen, at least at first, until the choice becomes familiar enough to feel like a default. There is a version of this that people attempt and find doesn't work, and it's worth describing so you know what to avoid. It is the performance of non-management. The conscious, deliberate attempt to appear not to be managing, to seem present, to seem unguarded, to seem like someone who has successfully stopped running the system, while the system continues to run underneath. The surface changes, the inner overhead does not. This version fails for an obvious reason. It adds a layer rather than removing one. You are now managing your emotional state, and managing the other person's emotional state, and managing the appearance of doing neither. The cost increases. The result from the outside often looks like detachment or distraction, because the person is not actually present. They are performing presence while being elsewhere. The genuine shift is not performed. It is structural. It happens when the underlying belief changes, when the assumption that their emotional state is your responsibility is replaced by something more accurate. It happens, typically, not through deciding to believe something different, but through accumulating enough experiences of not managing and observing that the consequences were survivable. I still confuse caring and managing more often than I'd like. Still feel the pull, in specific contexts with specific people, toward the preemptive smoothing, the rounding, the management of things that were not requesting management. The gap between understanding the mechanism and being reliably free of it is longer and more humbling than the understanding itself would suggest. Knowing what the layer is does not dissolve it. It makes it visible. Visible is better. It is not the same as gone. The boundary that isn't a fence has one property that the scripted limit does not. It is not dependent on the other person's response. The scripted limit, I need you to do X differently, requires the other person to receive it, process it, and change their behavior accordingly. If they don't, the limit has failed, and you are back to the drawing board. And the drawboard, for most people, is more distance or more conflict or more of the same exhausting pattern with the volume turned up. The internal shift does not require anything from them. It does not require them to change, or to understand, or to acknowledge that something has shifted. It changes what their presence can cost you, regardless of what they do. They can be exactly as needy, exactly as demanding, exactly as emotionally consuming as they have always been. If the assumption that their needs are automatically your problem has been genuinely revised, the cost changes. Not to zero, but significantly. This is the only form of change in this domain that is fully within your control. Everything else, their behavior, their patterns, the way they show up, requires their participation. The internal shift requires only yours. Dennis, from Chapter 8, has not changed. He still appears at doors. He still extends conversations past their natural conclusions. He still dresses neediness as collaboration with the consistency of someone who has been doing it long enough that it's no longer strategic. It's just how he is. Priya's relationship with Dennis's behavior has not required Dennis to do anything different. The people who manage their calendars around Dennis are waiting for Dennis to become a different person. This will take a while. Dennis is 53. The fence they've built is real. The cost of maintaining it is real. And Dennis, on the other side of the fence, is entirely unchanged and mildly puzzled about why certain colleagues are always so busy. The boundary that works is not the one Dennis can see. It is the one that exists before he arrives. Chapter 10. Presence without the costume. There is a conversation you have been preparing for that has not happened yet. Not a difficult conversation, necessarily. Not a confrontation or a negotiation or a deliberate attempt to change something. Just an ordinary interaction with a specific person in which you have, at some point between the last time you saw them and right now, assembled a version of yourself that will be ready when it happens. You have thought through what might come up. You have pre-constructed responses to things they haven't said yet. You have, in the quiet of your own preparation, already had several versions of this conversation and selected the approach most likely to produce an outcome you can live with. This is normal. This is what people who run the management pattern do automatically, without choosing to, because the system that runs it does not wait for instructions. It sees the interaction approaching and begins constructing the version. What is less often noticed is how much of the preparation is for a person who doesn't exist. The version of the other person you have been preparing for is a composite. It contains some accurate information. Their real patterns, their actual tendencies, the things they have genuinely said and done in previous interactions that you have filed as predictive. But it also contains projections, extensions of those patterns into scenarios that have not occurred. Worst-case configurations that your threat assessment system has constructed from available data and is now treating as the most likely scenario, because the system was built to weight negative outcomes more heavily than neutral or positive ones. The prepared-for version is more difficult than the actual person. More demanding, more fragile, more likely to produce the outcome you are preparing to avoid. The actual person, when they arrive, is often, not always, but often, considerably more manageable than the version you spent the weekend constructing. You will not always notice this, because the moment the actual person arrives, the preparation kicks in, and you are now responding to the composite, the real person plus the projected version, rather than to the person alone. The preparation shapes the interaction. It produces a more managed version of you, which produces a slightly more careful dynamic, which occasionally produces a slightly more cautious version of them, which confirms some portion of your projection, which validates the preparation as having been necessary. The self-fulfilling quality of the management pattern is one of its least convenient features. Think about a man named Elliot, 47, architect of his own small business, competent and largely self-aware. He has a business relationship with a woman named Frances, a contractor he has worked with for 3 years, whose communication style is direct to the point that Elliot has always experienced it as slightly aggressive. He manages his interactions with Frances carefully. He thinks through his emails before sending. He prepares his positions before calls. He has developed a specific, professionally warm tone for Frances' interactions that is distinctly different from how he communicates with people he finds less effortful. There is an important conversation approaching, a renegotiation of terms, something that requires directness and some degree of mutual vulnerability about what both of them need. Elliot has been preparing for approximately 2 weeks. He has drafted the email 17 times. He has pre-constructed Frances's likely objections and built responses to each. He knows what he wants. He knows, or believes he knows, what she'll push back on. He has, in his preparation, essentially had the entire conversation already. He sends the email. Frances responds within 4 hours. She agrees to most of what he proposed. She has one counter that is entirely reasonable. The whole thing resolves in 2 exchanges. Elliot sits with a strange feeling afterward. Not quite relief, not quite deflation, but something adjacent to both. He recognizes it only dimly. The sensation of having armored up for a battle that turned out to be a conversation. 2 weeks of preparation. 2 emails. The preparation was for a Frances who was not there. The costume, the version you assemble for specific people, does not feel like a costume. This has been said before in this book, in Chapter 3, and it bears returning to here because the mechanism is the same, but the cost at this stage is different. In Chapter 3, the cost was the performance tax, the energy required to maintain the version. Here, in this chapter, the cost is something more fundamental. It is the cost to the relationship itself. Because when you arrive in costume, when the version you bring to an interaction is assembled rather than present, the other person is not meeting you. They are meeting the version. And the version, however well constructed, however carefully calibrated to this specific relationship, is not capable of genuine contact. It can simulate warmth. It can produce appropriate responses. It can navigate the interaction with considerable skill. But it cannot be surprised. It cannot be moved. It cannot respond to what is actually there, because it arrived with its responses already prepared, and prepared responses are by definition not responses to the present moment. Genuine contact requires 2 people who are actually there. The costume removes one of them. The reason presence without the costume feels dangerous is not irrational. The management pattern was built, as has been established repeatedly in this book, in conditions where genuine presence carried real risk, where the unmanaged version of the interaction had consequences significant enough to warrant the overhead of management, where being caught without the costume, responding directly, without pre-screening, to whatever the other person brought, produced outcomes bad enough to make the costume worth its cost. Those conditions, in most cases, no longer exist. But the threat assessment was built in those conditions and has not been updated. And so the danger of arriving without preparation feels real even when the evidence for it is thin. The specific flavor of this danger is worth naming. It is not usually the fear of conflict exactly. It is something more like the fear of being inadequate in real time. The fear that without the preparation, without the pre-constructed responses and the managed version and the careful calibration, you will not be enough. That the unmanaged version of you, the one who responds to the present moment without having rehearsed the present moment first, will say something wrong, or miss something important, or produce an outcome that the prepared version would have prevented. The prepared version feels like protection. Presence feels like exposure. What most people who have lived inside the management pattern have never fully tested is whether the unmanaged interaction is actually as risky as it feels. This is not a call for recklessness. Not every relationship warrants unguarded presence, and not every moment is the right moment to arrive without preparation. There are interactions where preparation is genuinely necessary, where the stakes are real and the other person has demonstrated, through actual behavior, that care is warranted. But those interactions are rarer than the preparation schedule suggests. Most of the people you are preparing for do not require the preparation. Most of the interactions you are managing in advance are managing for outcomes that would not have occurred anyway. Most of the versions you assemble are responding to a threat that exists in the projection, not in the room. I once prepared extensively for a conversation that lasted 8 minutes and went in a direction I had not anticipated in any of my 17 prepared versions. And in that conversation, precisely because I had exhausted my preparation on scenarios that didn't materialize and had nothing left to deploy, I responded to what was actually there, without management, without the costume. And the conversation was, by a significant margin, the most genuine exchange I had had with that person in 3 years. Not because the absence of preparation was the goal, because the absence of preparation was the condition under which I accidentally showed up. The practical shape of this is less dramatic than it sounds. It does not require a wholesale dismantling of how you approach difficult relationships. It does not require arriving at every interaction deliberately unprepared in the hope that authenticity will supervene. It requires something smaller and more specific. The willingness in a particular moment to respond to what is actually in the room rather than to what you prepared for. This can be a single sentence, a single response that is the actual response rather than the managed one. A moment in which you do not round your reaction to the nearest acceptable version, but offer something closer to what you actually think. Not as performance of honesty, not as a deliberate act of vulnerability signaling, but simply as a person responding to a present moment. The first time this happens, it will feel wrong. The wrongness is not a signal that you made a mistake. It is the system registering that something outside its parameters occurred. The system flags the deviation. That flag is not information about whether the deviation was harmful. It is information that it was novel. Novel is not dangerous. It only feels that way because the system treating it as dangerous was built before you knew the difference. Elliot has started leaving one response in his Francis emails as the first draft. Not every response. Not the ones where the stakes are genuinely high and some preparation is warranted. Just one. Just occasionally. The reply where his first instinct was actually fine, and where the 17 revisions were removing something real rather than improving something rough. It costs him something each time. Not in the outcome. Francis, it turns out, is perfectly capable of handling direct. It costs him the specific discomfort of not knowing in advance how it will land. He has started to notice that not knowing in advance how it will land is different from it landing badly. For most of his adult professional life, he had been treating those two things as synonymous. They were never the same thing. The costume was protecting him from uncertainty, not from harm. And uncertainty, it turns out, is just presence by another name. Chapter 11. The ones worth the cost. Not all drain is a problem. This is the chapter that earns the right to say that, because the previous 10 chapters have done the work of distinguishing between drain that originates in the management pattern, the performance tax, the approval loop, the preemptive smoothing, the costume assembled in advance, and drain that is something else entirely. The earlier chapters were about understanding the mechanism. This one is about recognizing when the mechanism is not what's operating, because sometimes the cost is just the cost. Not a signal pointing at something in you that requires examination. Not a historical artifact running past its usefulness. Not the overhead of a management system that was built for conditions that no longer exist. Sometimes a relationship costs something because it is real, and real things have weight. And weight, when you carry it, registers as effort. The question is not whether the relationship costs you anything. The question is what the cost is purchasing. There is a difference between two kinds of drain that is not always easy to feel in the moment, but becomes clearer with some distance. The first kind leaves you depleted in a way that compounds. You emerge from the interaction with less than you entered with, and the less is not replenished by the relationship itself. It has to be replenished from elsewhere, from silence, from other people, from the recovery time you have quietly built into your schedule around this person. The interaction takes. The relationship, over time, runs a deficit, and the deficit accumulates in the specific way of something that is costing you without returning anything proportionate. This is signal drain. It is the kind this book has been about. It points at the mechanism, at the performance, the approval loop, the mirror, the management, and the signal, followed honestly, leads somewhere that can be addressed. The second kind is different in texture. It is the drain of genuine contact, of being actually present with another person who is also actually present, and of that contact registering, as it should, as it must, if it is real, as something that costs something. Grief costs something. Love costs something. The specific exhaustion of sitting with someone in real difficulty, not managing their difficulty but being present with it, costs something. This is not the overhead of performance. It is the weight of actual connection. And it feels different from the performance tax in the same way that muscle fatigue after genuine effort feels different from the tension of sustained anxiety. The signal drain depletes you in a way that feels like loss. The worth it drain depletes you in a way that feels, underneath the tiredness, like having been somewhere real. Think about a woman named Margot. 51, has been close friends with a man named Daniel for 22 years. Daniel is not easy. He has never been easy. He is intense in the way of someone whose interior life runs at a higher volume than most people's, and he brings that intensity to his friendships, with a consistency that means being his friend is, by design, not a low-maintenance proposition. He calls when things are difficult. He processes out loud. He returns to things. He requires, more than most people in Margot's life, actual presence. Not the managed, slightly at a distance presence that passes for connection in many relationships, but the real kind, where you are in the room and available, and not also backstage managing the production. Margot finds Daniel exhausting sometimes. She has never pretended otherwise, certainly not to herself. There are months where the calls are more than she has to give, and she says so. And Daniel, who is many things but is not oblivious, adjusts. There are visits that leave her quiet for a day afterward, not because something went wrong, but because something went right. And right means real. and real means it registered. She has never once, in 22 years, considered reducing Daniel to a manageable quantity. The thought is not available to her, or rather, it is available but immediately recognizable as the wrong thought. The thought that would make her life tidier and smaller and less worth having. Daniel costs something. He has always cost something. The cost, all 22 years of it, has been entirely worth paying. The distinction between signal drain and worth it drain is not primarily about the amount of drain. It is about the direction it points. Signal drain points inward, toward the mechanism, toward the performance, toward the historical artifacts and management reflexes that are generating overhead independent of the relationship's value. When you follow signal drain honestly, it leads to something about you, not about the other person. Something that can be examined and, with sufficient time and honesty, addressed. Worth it drain points outward and forward. It is the cost of genuine investment, of caring about something real, of being changed by contact with another person, of showing up without the costume for someone who requires actual presence. When you follow worth it drain, it leads to the relationship itself, to the specific gravity of something that matters. It does not point at a problem, it points at a reason. The practical challenge is that both feel like tiredness. Both leave you quiet afterward. Both require recovery. The difference is not in the texture of the exhaustion. It's in what the exhaustion means. And meaning is not always available in the moment. Sometimes you have to sit with the tiredness for a while before it becomes legible. There is a test that is not foolproof, but is more useful than most. Imagine the person is gone. Not in anger, not through conflict, not as a fantasy of escape. Simply, they are no longer in your life. The calls stop. The visits don't happen. The relationship has ended quietly and without drama, and you are now living the version of your life that doesn't include them. Is what you feel primarily relief? That is signal drain. The relationship has been running a deficit, and the deficit has accumulated to the point where its absence is the dominant register. This is useful information. It does not necessarily mean the relationship is over. The deficit may be addressable, but it tells you something about where the cost is coming from and whether the return is proportionate. Or is what you feel something more complicated than relief? A specific flatness that is not the same as tiredness. The particular absence of someone whose presence, whatever it cost, was part of how you understood yourself to be alive. If the removal produces that, the flatness, the subtracted quality, the sense that something real and irreplaceable has left the room, that is worth it drain. The cost was not overhead. It was the price of the thing itself. I watched someone do this calculation in real time, not through the thought experiment, through the actual removal. She had been close to a man for 6 years. He was difficult in the ways that the word difficult genuinely means. Demanding of time, emotionally complex, not always easy to be in the room with. She had been managing the question of whether the relationship was sustainable for most of the second half of those 6 years. She finally and deliberately reduced contact. Not dramatically, just the slow, managed fade that people use when they can't quite bring themselves to make the explicit decision. Within a few months, the exhaustion was gone. That part was as expected. What was not expected, what she described to me much later, with the particular expression of someone reporting something that did not confirm their hypothesis, was the other thing that was gone. A quality she couldn't name precisely. Something about the texture of her own thinking. A certain depth to her interior life that she had assumed was just her, and that turned out to have been at least partly, a function of being in contact with someone who took her seriously enough to push back, who required real presence rather than managed presence, who, for all the cost, had been returning something she hadn't known she was receiving. The drain was real. The drain was also partly the relationship. The absence of drain was also the absence of the relationship. She is not sure, still, whether she made the right call. That uncertainty is itself the information. Worth it drain does not resolve cleanly. It does not leave you confident that the removal was correct. Signal drain, addressed honestly, leaves you clearer. Worth it drain, removed, leaves you wondering. The people worth the cost share certain qualities. Though the qualities are not the ones you might expect, they are not necessarily easier to be with. Often they are harder. They are not more considerate of your energy, or more careful about what they ask of you, or better at calibrating their needs to your available capacity. Some of the most worth it people in a life are the ones who ask the most, who require the most actual presence, who give you the least opportunity for the managed, comfortable distance that makes most relationships easy to maintain. What they offer instead is the thing that managed relationships cannot provide: genuine contact. The specific experience of being met rather than navigated, of having your actual self encountered rather than the version you brought because it was safer, of being in a relationship where the cost is the cost of something real rather than the cost of the overhead on something performed. Ease is not the same as value. This is the sentence this chapter has been building toward, and the one most likely to be immediately understood and slowly forgotten. The relationships that cost you nothing are not automatically the ones worth having. Some of them cost nothing because nothing is happening in them. They are smooth and pleasant and navigable, and they return you at the end of each interaction exactly as you arrived. No more tired, no more alive. The ones that cost something and return something are a different category entirely. Worth it drain leaves you tired the way the last chapter of a book you didn't want to end leaves you tired. There is loss in it. There is also, underneath the loss, the clear and unmistakable sense of having been somewhere that mattered. Signal drain does not leave you with that. It leaves you needing Tuesday to recover, and wondering, by Wednesday, why you're already dreading the next one. Chapter 12. After the costume comes off. At some point, if you have followed this book honestly, something will change in how you show up for certain people. Not dramatically. Not through a conversation where you announce that things will be different now, or through a deliberate program of behavioral modification, or through a confrontation that clears the air and resets the relationship on better terms. The change will be quieter than that. It will arrive in small moments, a response that is less rounded than usual, a silence where there would normally have been management, a version of you that is slightly more present and slightly less prepared than the version that has been showing up for years. And then something will happen that this book has been quietly preparing you for. Some people will not notice. Some will notice and find it unremarkable. Some will notice and find it, to your quiet surprise, preferable, will respond to the less managed version of you with more ease than they ever responded to the managed version. Because the managed version, however careful and well-intentioned, always had a quality of glass to it. Transparent in some ways, untouchable in others. The real version lands differently. It has weight. People who value weight will feel it, and some will find it difficult. Some will push back, directly or indirectly, toward the version they know. Some will register the change as a withdrawal, as you becoming less available, less accommodating. less the person they have understood you to be. Some relationships will cool, some will require renegotiation, some will not survive the renegotiation. Both outcomes are information. The relationships that end when you stop performing in them are worth examining closely, because the examination produces something that is initially uncomfortable and ultimately clarifying. What ended was not a relationship with you. It was a relationship with the version you assembled for reasons that were once entirely reasonable in the conditions that no longer exist. The version that monitored and managed and rounded and preemptively smoothed. The version that was, in the specific sense of this book, performing. The other person was in a relationship with the performance. The performance was consistent. It was reliable. It was, in many ways, genuinely good. The version was not a lesser form of you. It was a capable and caring form. It simply was not the full form. But they related to it as though it were the full form, and they built their expectations accordingly. And when the full form appears, rougher in some places, more direct in others, less available for the overhead they had come to expect, it registers as change rather than as arrival. The loss is real. Do not minimize it in either direction, not toward dismissal, the relationship wasn't real anyway, or toward blame, they only wanted me for what I could provide. The person on the other side of this change has lost something genuine. The version they lost was genuinely there. The version they are now encountering is different, and different, even when it is better, involves loss. Grief for this is appropriate. It does not mean the change was wrong. The relationships that survive, and some will more than you might expect, reveal something specific about what they were built on. When you stop performing the version and the relationship continues, what is continuing is a relationship with whoever is actually there. Not the managed version, not the assembled presentation. The person who sometimes gets it wrong, who doesn't always round their responses, who does not reliably smooth the temperature before it drops. The person who is, and this word is unavoidable, real. These relationships have a different quality. Not necessarily easier, often the opposite, because genuine contact involves friction that management eliminates in advance. But there is something in them that the performed relationship never quite had. The specific quality of being known, of having the actual version of yourself encountered rather than the approved version, and of the encounter continuing. Of discovering that presence without the costume is not only survivable but, for certain people, preferable. This is the reward that is not promised and cannot be guaranteed, and is worth more than any of the alternatives. Consider Renata from Chapter 3, The Architect. The one with the Carol version, 30 years of iterative optimization, the mode that deploys automatically on alternate Sundays. The post-visit walk that is recovery in the vocabulary of preference. Renata has begun, in very small ways, to arrive differently, not to Carol as a project, not with the agenda of transforming the relationship or confronting the patterns or having the conversation that changes everything. Just, occasionally, in specific moments, she allows a less rounded response. She says something direct where she would previously have softened it. She does not once redirect a conversation that was heading somewhere uncomfortable. She simply stays in it and sees what happens. What happens is not what the threat model predicted. Carol does not fall apart. The room does not drop to an unmanageable temperature. Some things are slightly more awkward than they would have been in the managed version. Some things are, to Renata's genuine surprise, better. Carol responding to the directness with something that resembles for a moment, actual engagement, rather than the comfortable parallel play of two people managing each other's experience simultaneously. Not every Sunday. Not reliably. The Carol version still deploys, automatically, sometimes. 30 years of optimization does not deactivate in a season, but the range of what is possible between them has in some quiet way expanded. And the walk afterward, still taken, still necessary, is occasionally a few minutes shorter than it used to be. That is not a small thing. It is exactly the size of a real thing. There is a harder version of this story, the one where the relationship does not adjust, where the other person has been in a relationship with the performance for long enough, and where the performance has been central enough to the structure of the relationship, that its absence is not experienced as more of you, but as less of what was needed, where the change in you produces not adjustment, but withdrawal, where the relationship, deprived of the management that was holding it in its particular shape, loses its shape. These endings hurt in a specific way that is different from the hurt of an ordinary relationship ending. Because there is a question underneath the grief that is difficult to sit with. If they needed the performance, were they ever actually in a relationship with me? The honest answer is complicated. They were in a relationship with a version of you, a version that was yours, that came from you, that reflected real aspects of who you are, that was not fake or hollow or without value, but it was also the version that cost the most to maintain, the version built for historical conditions, the version that was always performing something even when the performance felt like presence. The relationship was real. The contact was incomplete. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and sitting with both of them at once is the work of this particular grief. There is one relationship I have tracked through this, quietly, across years. I know what it would cost to stop performing in it. I know which version gets deployed. I know the shape of the mode. I know the specific adjustments that happen in the first 30 seconds of contact. I understand the history of how the version was built, and the conditions it was built for, and the extent to which those conditions have resolved. I have not stopped. Not completely. The version still shows up, somewhat less automatically than it used to, with somewhat more of the actual person visible around the edges. But the full dismantling, the arrival as whoever I actually am, without the 30-year optimized mode, without the preemptive management, has not happened. I am not sure it will. I am not sure it needs to. What I know is that the performance, now that it is visible, is a choice rather than a reflex. Constrained, still. Expensive, still. But chosen. That is not resolution. It is not the ending the self-help version of this story would write. It is where the chapter actually lives. What the ending of a performance reveals, in every case, is what was underneath it. Sometimes what is underneath it is a relationship that was waiting for the real version. A connection that the management had been, paradoxically, preventing, holding the other person at exactly the distance required to keep the version sustainable, which is exactly the distance at which genuine contact cannot occur. These relationships, when the performance ends, become something they were never quite able to be before. Not perfect, not without friction, but actual. Sometimes what is underneath it is the absence of a relationship. The performance, removed, reveals that it was the performance that was generating the sense of connection, the care and attentiveness and careful calibration that felt like intimacy, but was, more precisely, excellent management. Without it, there is less there than expected. The relationship was the version's relationship. The real version has not been here before, and there is no pre-existing connection waiting to receive it. Both outcomes are information. This has been said already in this chapter, and it bears the repetition, because information is the correct frame. Not success or failure, not proof that the change was right or that it was a mistake. Information about what was actually there, beneath the performance, all along. The relationships that survived the performance stopping are the only ones you will ever be certain were real. Not because they are easier, or because they confirm that you are loved unconditionally, or because they provide the resolution that would make a tidy final chapter, but because they are the ones in which the other person encountered the actual version and continued, in which your presence, imperfect, unmanaged, occasionally direct in ways that land with friction, was met rather than navigated. You will not have many of these, probably fewer than you'd like, possibly more than you currently believe. They are, without exception, worth more than everything that required the costume. The costume was very good. You made it well. You wore it for a long time, in conditions that genuinely warranted it, for people and reasons that were real. It was never you. And the ones who stay when it comes off, those ones were always meeting someone real. They just had to wait for you to show up. Here is where most books of this type would offer you a summary. A clean recapitulation of the key insights, organized for retention. The performance tax, the approval loop, the mirror problem, the management reflex, all of it assembled into a final architecture of understanding that you can carry out of the book and reference later, like a map you've been given for territory you're about to enter. This book is not going to do that, not because the ideas don't bear repeating, but because by this point, if the book has worked at all, the summary is already inside you in a form that is more useful than any list of concepts. It is in the quality of attention you are bringing, right now, to the specific person who has been somewhere in the back of your mind since the second word of the title. That person has probably shifted slightly in how they appear to you. Not dramatically, not into sympathy or indifference or resolution, but shifted, the way an image shifts when you understand what you're actually looking at. You are not looking at someone who drains you. You are looking at someone in whose presence something in you activates. A version, a mode, a performance, an old response to an old pattern that costs more than the relationship itself should cost. They did not install that cost. They may not even know it's there. They are, in most cases, simply being who they are, in the particular way they have learned to be, and that way has encountered the particular way you have learned to manage yourself, and the collision of those two things produces the experience you've been calling their drain. It was never theirs. The debt is the clearest frame for what this book has been describing, and it is worth staying with for a moment at the end. The exhaustion you feel after certain people is not what they take. It is what you spend. And what you spend, in most cases, is a form of payment on a debt. A debt whose terms were established long ago in circumstances that had genuine authority over you, by people or dynamics or experiences that taught you, convincingly and at an impressionable age, that certain things were owed, that you owed performance, that you owed management, that the emotional comfort of the people around you was a bill that arrived at your address, regardless of whether you had incurred it, that the safe version of yourself, the one that monitored and adjusted and pre-screened and rounded, was not optional but structural, not a choice but a condition of the relationships being okay. These lessons made sense when they were learned. The environment that taught them was real. The authority it had over you was real. The child or the young person or the earlier version of you who absorbed those lessons and built those systems was not wrong to do so. They were responding to actual conditions with actual intelligence. The conditions have changed. The debt remains on the books. What changes when you understand this is not immediate, and it is not complete, and it is not, in the main, dramatic. It is a shift in where you look when the drain arrives. Instead of outward, at what they did, at how they are, at the accumulating case for why this person costs so much, you look at the mechanism, at the version that deployed, at the mode that activated, at the specific demand that their presence made on you and the specific historical reason you are still meeting that demand. The look is not always comfortable. In Chapter 6, it was genuinely difficult. In Chapter 7, it arrived at something most people prefer to locate elsewhere. The discomfort is not incidental to the understanding. It is evidence of it. The places that resist examination are precisely the places where the mechanism has the most work to do. But the look changes things. Not because insight is magic, and not because understanding a pattern dissolves it, and not because the people in your life will conveniently transform the moment your relationship to your own management reflex shifts. The look changes things because it relocates the locus of the problem from the only place you have no control, other people, to the only place you have any, yourself. The people who have been draining you are not going to read this book. They are, in most cases, completely unaware that the dynamic you've been experiencing exists. They are living their lives, being who they are, relating in the ways they have learned to relate, and they are not, or very rarely, deliberately consuming anything. There is no vampire. There is no predator. There is a person and a mechanism, and the mechanism is yours. This is the part that initially sounds like bad news and turns out to be the opposite. Because if the mechanism were theirs, the options would be limited. Change them, avoid them, or endure them. Those options are all real, and sometimes one of them is the right call. But they are the options of a person whose problem lives outside themselves. Bounded. Dependent on other people's willingness to change or on your ability to manage proximity. If the mechanism is yours, the options multiply. You can examine it. You can understand where it formed and why. You can notice in real time when it activates and what it costs. You can choose, sometimes, to not run the full management sequence for a person who has not earned that level of vigilance. You can let one interaction be cheaper than the system would have made it, and then another. And then, slowly, unevenly, with backsliding and revision and the particular humility of someone who has understood something intellectually long before they have integrated it practically, you can begin to change what their presence actually costs, not to zero. Genuine relationships always cost something, and some cost more than others, and some cost more than they return, and those are the ones worth addressing with honesty rather than endurance. But to something proportionate, something that reflects the actual present tense person in front of you, in the actual present tense interaction, rather than the full accumulated weight of every version of this pattern you have ever encountered, compressed into one Tuesday afternoon. There is a specific moment this book has been pointing toward, and it is not a dramatic one. It is an ordinary interaction with a person who has reliably cost you more than they should. And in this interaction, not because you prepared for it, not because you arrived with a strategy, not because you made a conscious decision to do anything differently, you notice the mode beginning to activate. The version assembling, the management reflex reaching for the controls, and you see it. Clearly, without judgment, the way you might notice a habit without needing to condemn it. And the cost is, in that moment, slightly lower than it has ever been. Because what you are spending now is the cost of the actual interaction. Not the projected one, not the managed one, not the historical one. Weighted with every similar encounter your nervous system has archived. Just this one. Just this person, in this moment, costing what they actually cost. That is the thing this book was trying to give you. Not a framework. Not a set of tools. Not permission to feel the way you already feel about the people who leave you tired. A more accurate address. The debt was never yours. It was assigned to you in conditions you did not choose, by dynamics that had genuine power over you, at a time when you had limited options for response. You did not take it on foolishly or weakly. You took it on the way anyone takes on a debt in a system that presents the debt as mandatory. Because the alternative appeared to cost more, and because nobody showed you the line on the form where you could have declined. You can decline now, not all at once, not without cost, not in every relationship or every interaction or every moment where the old system reaches confidently for the controls, but in one moment, and then another after that. And the drain, which was never about them, will change. Not because they changed, because you finally located the meter. And the meter, it turns out, was always yours to read and yours to turn down.